It's time to learn about the wisdom of Walt. Jeff Barnes is here, and you're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on the Tomorrow Society podcast. I'm your host, Dan Heaton, and today's guest is Jeff Barnes, who is an expert on Disneyland. He's an inspirational speaker. He's also written several books, one that will be out very soon. And the reason I wanted to have him on the show is just how much I connected with his book, The Wisdom of Walt. Back in 2016, it was a challenging year for me. I was in a job that was not a good fit and I did not enjoy. I was out of work for several months, and I found myself reading a lot of inspirational or self-help books. And after a while, the books all started to flow into each other. You read some of the same advice, it's written in a similar way. The impact of those publications got to be pretty limited. There is an exception, though, and one of the exceptions was Jeff's book. And I read it over last summer, and it came at just the right time. There were several reasons that it clicked so much for me. One of them, obviously, is that Jeff used stories from Walt Disney's life and about Disneyland in order to connect to the goals and the message that he was giving. And to someone like me, that's easily going to be simpler to connect with because of my interest in theme parks and Disney in general. And the other thing, too, is the way that he talks about his own life and connects that to the goals, too. It's quite a down-to-earth book, and I don't mean that in any critical way. What I mean is it's very easy to connect with Jeff and the message he's giving, especially for Disney fans. And that's why I thought it really made sense to have him on the show. I think it was a really good conversation. Jeff has a lot of good stories from both Walt's life and his own that are easy to connect with for us. And I'm really excited to read his new book, which comes out very soon. So let's get to it. Let's get to my conversation with Jeff Barnes. All right. Well, I am here with Dr. Disneyland himself, Jeff Barnes. He's the author of the great book, The Wisdom of Walt, and the upcoming book, Beyond the Wisdom of Walt. Also a professor who teaches classes on the history of Disneyland, and I know is an avid fan of the parks. Jeff, thank you so much for doing the podcast.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to be talking with you. So it's
well, good to be with you and your listeners.
If you aren't aware of what Jeff's done, I'm excited to have you on the show because I think you have a really good story, and what you're doing could be helpful to a lot of different people, not just Disney fans. So it's cool.
Well, thanks, Dan. It's been a really great journey, and it started out really as sort of an idea 25 years ago, and morphed into a university class, and with a lot of twists and turns along the way. It's turned into a best-selling book and now a follow-up book that'll be out in October. And, any part of my story that helps someone else live a better version of their own story, that's really what all this is about.
Well, great. Well, we're definitely going to talk about both books, but I'm curious to learn a bit more about going way back. Where did your interest in Walt Disney originate? Like, how far back do we go, and what really drove it?
Yeah, I grew up in the 1960s and am old enough to remember, things like, The Wonderful World of Disney on Sunday nights. And, my dad was in the military, so we ended up moving to Florida in the early 70s. And in 1974, and I was 10 years old, went to my first Disney park, which was Walt Disney World in Florida. And I vividly remember stepping onto Main Street and just instantly knowing that this place was different and it was special, and I wanted to be there rather than anywhere else I'd ever been in the world at that point. And so moving forward, if we were returning for a vacation or, there was like a high school trip, a band trip, whatever, I was the kid who was, most excited and, literally counting down the days since the last time I'd been or, when we were going again. And it just sort of became this instant connection and this instant infection, if you will. And, fast forward to 1988 and I moved to Northern California in the Bay Area and finally have a chance to go to Los Angeles and Disneyland for the first time. And, based on what I had experienced in Florida growing up, I was really disappointed in the original park. I thought it was too small, was way too hot, way too crowded. And ironically enough, and I write about this in the first book, that first night at the end of the first day, all I wanted was out of there. And if you had told me that, 30 years later, I'd be doing this, I would have said you were absolutely nuts. But I lived in California long enough to realize that there is a connection in California with local residents that far surpasses anything that I experienced or enjoyed in Florida. And so just seeing that got me really, really curious. And I guess if anything, Dan, I'm insatiably curious. And so I started reading about Walt. And that's when I learned, like all of us, Walt started out as a very normal and ordinary person and, didn't have this fantastic childhood and, grew up relatively poor. And rather than having everything handed to him, he had these dreams and he had these goals and he had these visions and he had enough courage to go for it. And despite all of these obstacles and all of these barriers, whether it's losing Oswald and coming up with Mickey Mouse or, no one believing that you can take a cartoon and turn it into a full-length animated feature film, which is what he did with Snow White, or, even after he'd made a name for himself and was successful, has this crazy dream for an amusement park over and over again, he had to prove himself. And it was that story that really sort of motivated and inspired me to take what so many people enjoy and figure out a way to mold it and shape it in such a way that it can actually help each of us with our own goals and our own dreams and our own vision and our own story.
Yeah, now that's really interesting. It's funny that you mentioned Disney World versus Disneyland because I think a lot of people, like when I was a kid, I went to Disney World a lot and barely went to Disneyland. And there is that adjustment where you go at first and you see it is smaller scale, but it's so intimate and there's so much history to it. And that's something that when you go more, I agree, it just really connects. So you mentioned Walt's life and kind of his story. Did it connect to you? Like, did you see things in your own life, in Walt's life, when you read more about what he had experienced?
Oh, there are so many similarities. I'm about ready to go to a psychiatrist and get all of this stuff broken down. I drive my wife nuts with it sometimes. I think, first of all, this idea that he was a daydreamer. And, I know, despite having a career in higher education, I struggle to stay focused and I, struggle to pay attention. And, more often than not, I kind of live in my own world. And, those stories are very similar to, the stories that Walt told, from his own years in school and his own childhood. I love the connection that he has with Mickey Mouse and, this idea that I'm going to create this character that is going to morph into kind of an alter ego. And I write about that in the book, this idea of trusting what I call your Walter ego, which is a little bit of a wordplay there. And, even after Walt died, every time Lillian saw Mickey, it made her cry because, he reminded her of Walt so much. And, I have sort of created very similar sorts of characters in my own life and in my own world. And then I think just this idea that, you have these thoughts, these ideas, these dreams, these visions. And, Dan, I believe the same is true for you. I believe it's the same true for our listeners. What really separated Walt was courage and confidence, and I think ultimately action. he didn't just think of a place where parents and children could have fun together. He ultimately got off of that bench and started taking action to see that come true, even though his wife didn't agree with it and his brother didn't agree with it, and the banks didn't agree with it, and the corporate sponsors didn't agree with it. Walt believed in it, and he changed our world because of the actions that he took.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, because I think we can easily fall into it, and I've done it before. You have this idea of Walt Disney, this guy who did these amazing things, and almost like he's an imaginary character. But it's important to look back at what he succeeded, but the obstacles he faced. What do you think it was about, from your research, about Walt's personality that allowed him to succeed when he faced a lot of obstacles, a lot of tragedy and difficulties, business-wise and personally, but he found a way to create these amazing things? What was this about his personality that really made that difference?
Well, first of all, we have to remember, and he's been gone for a little more than 50 years now, and you're right. We remember the successes, Mickey Mouse and Snow White and Disneyland and ultimately Walt Disney World. And what we have forgotten is that Walt Disney failed more often than he succeeded. And the lesson there is you're going to fail, and if you're not failing, it's simply because you're not trying. And those failures will ultimately lead you to exactly where you're supposed to be. So, for example, he goes bankrupt in Kansas City. Well, if Laugh-O-Gram Studio had been a success, maybe Walt spends the rest of his life in Kansas City and the rest of his career creating animation advertisements for a local dentist. But unfortunately, the studio goes bankrupt, and that's what compels him to California. And once he comes to California, that's when he joins forces with his older brother, Roy. Together form the Disney Brothers Studio that today is the largest entertainment company anywhere in the world. And so the success was born out of that failure. It gets repeated all over again with Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. It was the loss of Oswald to Charles Mintz and Universal that forced him, in order to avoid bankruptcy again, to come up with a completely different character. And Walt was fond of saying, let us never forget, it all started with a mouse. And that's true, but it was a mouse born out of desperation after he had lost Oswald. And then, when it comes to Disneyland, this idea that every obstacle is against him, and yet he believed in it so much that he was willing to challenge his wife, he was willing to challenge his brother, he was willing to challenge the studio, and see that thing happen. And I think there's a level of commitment here. I refer to it as being, quote unquote, all in on your dreams. And I think the real decision point was when Walt was in Kansas City. After Laugh-O-Gram had gone bankrupt and he's homeless and eating beans out of a garbage can, he could have stayed there in Kansas City, gone and gotten a regular job, and fallen back on friends and family members. Or he could board a train with $40, a single suitcase, and a one-way ticket. And fortunately, Walt Disney decided to go all in on his dream. And it's that level of commitment, despite the failures, that brought him to success.
Yeah, and I think that's a great story right there, because just seeing what he was able to accomplish, he was a very talented guy, but that persistence, you even saw it further in life when he was thinking of trying to do Epcot, the city, which is, it's too bad that he was never able to do that, because while a lot of the plans sound crazy, totally ambitious, the odds are pretty good he would have come up with something amazing. So that's a good example too. I mean, he did so much, but very few times it was easy for him. So
it was almost never easy. And I think one of the reasons for that is Walt never wanted to repeat himself. He didn't believe in doing sequels. And so, cartoons weren't enough. He wanted to do a full-length animated feature film. Full-length animated feature film wasn't enough. He wants to take the guest and literally put them into the story by creating this 3D outdoor entertainment venue by way of Disneyland. And even with Disneyland, again, he didn't want to repeat himself with the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. Florida, before Walt died, was all about Epcot. He wanted to get into urban planning and solve the real problems of the inner city, which in the 1960s were, pretty persistent. And, is that, he was constantly changing. He was constantly growing. He was constantly evolving. And again, that's a challenge to each of us to not stand still, don't repeat yourself, never be finished.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's impressive to see how much he accomplished. And I think you outlined it really well in the book. But one thing I wanted to mention before we get to the book is kind of what was a big step for you, which was when you finally took the plunge and decided to teach the class about Disneyland. So I know you mentioned going to Disneyland at first and how it was a rough day, lots of lines and heat and everything. And you describe it really well in the book. But what really changed? How did Disneyland evolve to continue to resonate that much for you, where you eventually decided you wanted to teach a class on it?
For me, the real turning point, aside from learning Walt's story, is the concept that he built the park for the purpose of storytelling. Walt most wanted to be remembered as a storyteller. And the ultimate example of that is what he did with an amusement park by building it around a theme and using those attractions to tell stories. And I love story. I've done a lot of research in my higher education career about story. And so this idea that you're going to have an amusement park built around story, that's the part that really resonates with me. And that's the part that really, turned the corner. And so, one of my favorite features is when you go through the tunnels entering onto Main Street, the attraction posters that hang in those tunnels, because it's a reminder that each of those attractions tells a story. And those are the stories that lay ahead in the day that awaits you as you get deeper and deeper into the park. And so it was really this narrative and this storytelling element, and ultimately the way in which it can connect to our own story and challenge us to then go out and live our own great story. That's the part that, really has captured me and the part that has, made it this ongoing obsession.
Right, because every attraction, while on the surface there's it's a thrill, or there's the amazing animatronics, but there's a story behind every attraction. One, the history of it, but two, what it's telling you, or what, you're taking the ride like Pirates of the Caribbean or the Haunted Mansion or Space Mountain or something. You're involved in that story, and that's what connects so strongly with me. And on a related note, because I know if I was in college and there was a history of Disneyland class, I would have, been the first one, like, pounding down your door basically to take it. But you're a history teacher, so I know it's not just about, this is cool to take some kids to Disneyland. What is it about Disneyland's history that you think is so important to pass along to, especially to younger generations? Because people that grew up after Walt, I grew up after Walt had died, but I was born like 10 years after. So it was still kind of resonant, and we had the Disney Channel and a lot of things. But for people that were born much later than me, that are 18, 20 years old, why do you think it's so important for them to recognize and actually know more than just what they're seeing when they walk in?
Great question, Dan. And there's a couple of reasons for why this class I think is really important. First of all, especially here in Southern California, we have an entire generation that is consuming the park. And because of the presence of annual pass holders, and many of these students are coming out of families that have a pass each and every year, they've never known a world where Disneyland didn't exist. It's always been in their backyard. In fact, most of my students don't even remember their first time at Disneyland because they were so young. And so as a result, they sort of take the park for granted, and they know nothing about Walt Disney because he's this mythical figure. And the very first day, in the very first lecture, I give a whole presentation on the Walt Disney of Disneyland, because again, they don't know that he was born poor, and they don't know that he had a challenging childhood, and they don't know that he failed more often than he succeeded. And so to make him a real person then helps you to realize that, wow, if Walt could do it coming out of those circumstances, maybe I can do it as well. And then secondly, I genuinely believe that the park is an accurate reflection, a mirror, if you will, of who we are as people from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. So, for example, to really understand the way that Walt laid out Disneyland, you have to understand the evolution of television in 1955. So, for example, he's going to create this entire outdoor arena for the purpose of telling stories. Well, Walt's coming out of Hollywood, where as a director and as a producer, he has ultimate control either by animation or with live action by way of a soundstage. Well, how is he going to get that control in an outdoor environment? Well, first of all, he's going to dictate that an amusement park has a single entrance in and a single exit out. That was completely unheard of in 1955. And one of the main reasons why other amusement park operators said, look, this is never going to work. It's going to be a complete failure. But Walt was accustomed to controlling the opening shot and the concluding scene because he knew that's what people would remember most. And then secondly, he created this berm around the perimeter of the park, most of which the railroad runs on. And that was his way of keeping the magic of the Magic Kingdom in and all of the distractions of the outside world out. In other words, that earthen berm really serves as the soundstage that he was accustomed to shooting in down in Hollywood. And then lastly, this, sort of idea that once you get to the Central Plaza, yes, I want to control the opening scene. Yes, I want to control the closing shot. But he also wants to give the guests choices. He wants to, have you get the opportunity to play a part in your own story. Well, when the park opened in July of 1955, you've got 4 options: Adventureland, Frontierland, Fantasyland, and Tomorrowland. Well, why 4 options? Because that's the average number of television channels that were available in Los Angeles in 1955. And more specifically, adventure, cowboys and Indians and Westerns, cartoons and fantasy, and what's going on in space, those are the most popular genres on television in 1955. And so that's the history and the way in which the park mirrors and reflects, at least when it opened, who we were and what was going on in the United States in 1955.
Now, those are really great points. I probably could spend about an hour with you on each one. That's a really great point about the 4 options, because you notice that when you see his TV shows, where basically they would have the credits to the Disneyland TV show, and they would go through Frontierland, Adventureland, Fantasyland, Tomorrowland, and just the way even that's presented, it's so simple. I mean, not that it's not now, but it was brilliantly marketed, which that is, I think he's not always valued for that.
We take corporate synergy and infomercials for granted in 2017. Walt introduced that to us in 1954 with the Disneyland TV show, and then 1955 with the opening of the park. One of the Imagineers sort of laughs and scoffs at virtual reality because he says, when we put guests in Disneyland in 1955, we were the first to do virtual reality.
That's a great example. And the berm that you mentioned, it's still even now amazing to me when you're outside the park and there's the different hotels and the Denny's and everything, and you go inside the berm and it's like you're in a completely different world, and you know what's all around you. There's a freeway, there's everything, but that effect still works. And that connects well to the book too, because in the book you have a chapter where you talk about the berm, and in terms of how it shows an example of finding focus. Basically, Disneyland has so many different things going on, but we're able to focus because there's not all those outside forces drawing in. Could you talk a bit about how that connected for you in terms of how we can find focus?
Sure. I think one of the most important skill sets, especially in the distracted world that we live in today, one of the most important skill sets in seeing your dreams come true is the ability to focus. We're not good multitaskers, despite all of the technology that is saying to us, you can do everything all at the same time. No, that's not exactly how we're wired as human beings. And that ability to hyper-focus, even if it's only for a few minutes on one thing, is how you push that dream and how you push that goal forward. And the example that we have of why that is important is every time we step into Disneyland, we know that we are in the Magic Kingdom. We know that we are in Disneyland. And it's the berm that serves as that protection from all of those distractions and everything that is going on outside, in Southern California. I mean, people forget you're in Disneyland and you're surrounded by the Magic Kingdom and 40, 50,000 other people. Beyond that berm, there's up to 25 million people. And you completely forget that when you're inside Disneyland. In fact, it's funny we're having this conversation because we're working on the language of the book cover for the new book. And grammatically, I should be saying at Disneyland, but I always refer to it as being in Disneyland because the berm allows you to feel that distinction between being at someplace versus being in someplace.
Right. Yeah. Because I think about when I went most recently and you fly in on an airplane, you get on a bus, and all of a sudden it's like I was walking down Main Street and I was like, how did I even get here? This is like a completely different world. Like I'm standing there in front of the castle like, what, where am I? It's hard to get that experience anywhere in the world, especially when you're among that many people. It's not like I was, off in the mountains somewhere. So let's talk about the book. So I'm sure, judging by the book, these ideas have been percolating in your brain for years, but what made you decide to finally bear down and write The Wisdom of Walt?
Well, it was one of those forks in the road where I had to make a decision. And I think every dream requires that sort of commitment and that sort of decision at some point where, I was going to go all in and I was either going to do it or I wasn't. And I write about it in the book. I finally had the courage to ask the university, hey, what would you think if I were to develop a course on the history of Disneyland? Now, I thought I was going to be laughed off of campus for pitching what is so obviously a Mickey Mouse idea.
Yeah.
But despite my fears and concerns, they actually thought it was pretty good. And so for the next year, I worked on everything necessary to make this a legitimate college course with syllabus and textbooks and assignments, guest lecturers, field trips, you name it. Gave the very first lecture, Dan, in May of 2014, and then the very next day was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And it was that medical emergency that helped me to realize, you know what, I'm willing to risk my life for this thing. I am willing to take what I know about Walt Disney and Disneyland, and I'm so committed to connecting this to our students' story that I'm going to risk my life, put off brain surgery by 2.5 months so I can teach this class. And that's what I did. And so after we had the surgery in late July of 2014, and we went through a rather lengthy recovery period, and we went back to work, and we went back into the classroom, I said to my wife, Nikki, I said, it's great that I got to teach the class last summer. It's great that the surgery went well. It's great that I'm healthy and I'm back to work. But long before there was a class idea, there was a book idea. And, if that had been the end and I had, for whatever reason, not recovered from having a brain tumor, my one regret in life would have been that I never did anything with the book idea. And my wife, Nikki being as great as she is, she looked at me, she said, you're 51 and that's your biggest regret? You're doing better than most. And what do we need to do today to make sure we get that done as well? And again, it was one of those all-in sort of commitments. And I think having gone through medically what I had gone through that summer, I was just sort of at a point where, we were ready to make, that sort of difficult all-in decision. And so we took something that had been percolating for 20, 25 years, once I made that commitment from start to finish, we wrote the book in 142 days.
Well, I mean, that's a great story, and I know I've read it all through in the book, and it really puts a lot of things in perspective. But 142 days, even given everything you went through, that is really fast, especially because I feel like one of the really strong suits of the book is it seems really well put together. It doesn't feel like it seems like a book easily could have taken you 4 years to write, though it sounds like you kind of were writing it in your head for a long time beforehand.
That's exactly what happened. And I can say that, Dan, having just finished the second book. The second book was easier to write because I had more confidence and I had a format that I trusted after having finished the first book. And yet I kept finding myself having to stop the writing and go back and do a lot more reading and a lot more research. Whereas with the first book, the reading and the research were done. I didn't realize it was done, but it was done. And I just had to go back and double check things because I'd pretty much been doing the reading and the research for the past 20, 25 years. If I had an opportunity to read anything for pleasure, if I had the opportunity to just sort of go out and learn something on my own, it was always about either Walt Disney or Disneyland or something to do with life and leadership and success. And what we do with the book is we marry all of that, and it ultimately became The Wisdom of Walt.
Yeah, and I think the research that you did, and that's really interesting to hear about how you had pulled a lot of it together because the book is very well researched. You cite a lot of other sources to support your points, and that's something that we don't always see. There's a lot of business books or books about Walt Disney and Disney that connect to business, and there are a lot of them that are very good. But what I found really interesting about yours is it stayed grounded. I think because you put in stories about your wife and how the courtship there, and then about your surgery. And was that really something that you focused on a lot, was making sure that you tied it back as much as you could? I'm assuming it was, but into your personal story?
I think that was probably the biggest risk that we took. You're right, Dan. There are some great Disney business leadership books out there. Lee Cockrell has done some wonderful work.
Yeah.
Doug Lip and Disney University is another book that comes to mind. And there are also some great Disney history books. I couldn't do what I do if it wasn't for Jim Korkis and, David Koenig and a lot of what, Marty Sklar, who I'm sure you're aware recently passed away.
Yeah.
What he's done, with Dream It, Do It, and One Little Spark. I haven't worked for Disney, and I'm not interested, even though I'm in academics, I'm not interested in writing a Disney history book, and I wasn't also interested in trying to write another Disney business book because it's already been done, and quite frankly, it's already been done really well. I wanted to take what Walt did with the park, and that is, what can we do around story? And the vision here was, well, if Walt can use the attractions to tell stories, why can't I use Walt's story and the story of the park as kind of a vehicle to tell some of my own personal stories, genuinely hoping that that would be that sort of last connection emotively with the reader so that they would feel some sort of connection and ultimately get off their own park bench and follow their own ideas and follow their own dreams. I wasn't sure that it was going to work, but it's what I hear most from readers of what they like most about The Wisdom of Walt, and that is it's not just about Walt, although they love that, and it's not just about Disney or Disneyland. They love that as well. They feel that personal connection, and they feel as though it's speaking directly to them as a result.
Well, excellent. It definitely connected with me. And I want to make sure we spend time talking about your new book, which is coming out fairly soon. I know you're still working on finalizing a few things, called Beyond the Wisdom of Walt. And I know it has this cover shot that I've seen, at least, has a shot of Spaceship Earth on the front cover. So tell me a little bit about what the focus of this book is.
Sure. So as I shared with you earlier, my journey with Disney Parks started at Walt Disney World in Florida. I spent the last 20, 25 years really focused and obsessed on Walt and Disneyland, knowing that Anaheim is the original and the only Disney park that Walt himself ever actually walked in, and was just completely obsessed and all in on that idea and that and that concept. And then after we finished, the Wisdom of Walt 2 years ago, I started having a little bit more free time and, had the opportunity to meet David Koning at a book signing and, picked his book up on Walt Disney World called Reality Land, and started realizing that as much as Disneyland was a dream for Walt Disney in Southern California, even in 1955, it was really only 30 miles south of a major city in Los Angeles. What happened in Florida, Dan, was a miracle. And I say that because, Orlando and Central Florida was a true backwater in 1965. And what it took to convert 27,000 acres of almost complete swampland into the vacation kingdom of the world is really just an incredible story. And so, yeah, I love the original, and I love how, nobody wanted to believe in Disneyland and nobody wanted to believe in Walt. And now here we are, we're going to Florida 10 years later. And, why are they going to Florida, and how are they going to balance, Walt's belief in never repeating himself and, not wanting to do sequels. And, they're going to convert all of this swampland into this incredible city of tomorrow. And in the middle of that, without having even broken ground, Walt dies. And what can we learn from all of that? And so as I started thinking not only about what happened in Florida, but also some of the other life and leadership lessons that we didn't have time or room to cover in the first book, I soon realized, wow, we've got a second book here. And we got to work on that about a year and a half ago, and it's come together, and we sent it to the editor and the publisher last month, and it's going to be out October 1st, and we're really excited about it.
Well, excellent. That sounds fascinating. As like I mentioned earlier, as somebody who grew up going to Disney World, mostly in the 80s and 90s, I find the history of that to be fascinating. Like the biography of Roy Disney that I believe Bob Thomas wrote has some just fascinating stories about what Roy had to deal with. And I assume that some of what you'll be diving into and will go into some of Roy's experiences. Is that true?
Absolutely. So a couple of really interesting points there. First of all, Roy was on his way to retirement when Walt died. And, despite the fact that, there's sort of this illusion of, Walt being the creative genius and Roy's the more grounded financial, part of the company. And a good bit of that is true. When it came to the parks toward the end, Roy was a big believer in what Walt was trying to do. So much so that, within a few days after Walt passing away, it was Roy who made the commitment of it's not going to be called Disney World, it's going to be called Walt Disney World, which was a tribute to his younger brother. And Roy delayed retirement to ensure that at least the first phase, which was always going to be the theme park, it was always going to be Magic Kingdom, and then they would get Epcot. He wanted to make sure that got done the way that his brother wanted it done. And so while they didn't stray true to Epcot when they got around to it in 1982, the basic plan runs true to what Walt had sketched out on a napkin. And what Walt had reminded Roy was the plan, and he drew it all out on the ceiling tiles at St. Joseph Hospital across the street from the studio in Burbank. He laid it all out for Roy the night before he died. And, the company from a financial perspective, wanted to say, look, why are we building the Magic Kingdom and why are we building this theme park 5 miles in? We can do it on the front end of the property right next to I-4 and save a ton of money. And Roy's like, no, we're going to do it the way Walt wanted it done. And Roy stayed consistent to that and got it opened in October of 1971. And then he himself passed just 2 months later.
Yeah, and that's what Roy had to do to get that built. Because it seems now, kind of like Disneyland, it's one of those things where you think, oh, it's been there forever. Like you've mentioned, it's not something that, that ever had to be built. But there was a good chance that never would have happened either. So I'm excited to hear more from that. Are you going to be able to incorporate any of your own personal experiences into the book, kind of like you did with the Wisdom of Walt?
I wouldn't know how not to, Dan. So, Yeah, we've got what I think are some great stories in there, and some great challenges to the reader. Again, about seeing their own dreams come true. And I get excited when I go to Disney World. We were just there last month, and you drive onto the property, and you see that sign, the place where dreams come true, which is a wonderful, wonderful marketing slogan. But I mean, let's be honest with each other. We all have bigger dreams than spending another day at an amusement park. What can we use from those days to then go out and, again, see our own dreams come true? And that's what I wanted to do with the Wisdom of Walt, and what I believe we're going to continue to do with beyond the Wisdom of Walt. Going back to Roy here for just a second, as the leader of the company and the person who's holding the purse strings and the financial end of the house together, before Walt died, Roy had been to Imagineering, or what was then WED, or Walter Elias Disney Enterprises. He had been to WED in Glendale one time. And now he's got to lead this group to get Disney World built in Florida.
That is crazy. It shows, too, how detailed and specific Walt's vision was and how well he could communicate that. Because I'm sure Roy had to make adjustments going on. But the fact that his brother had come up with such a detailed plan, and that Roy was so persistent, because even though he was his brother, not everyone would have been able to do what he did, especially at his age. So I was amazed reading a few years ago when I read the biography, just how much he did in those last few years to really make it happen.
Yeah. Roy was at Walt's, feet the morning that he died. And again, it was Roy who insisted that they call it Walt Disney World. It was Roy who delayed retirement to see that it got built. And it was Roy who died 2 months after it opened. And I think an argument could be made that, seeing his brother's final wish come true, ultimately did Roy in. Now, I mean, he lived a relatively long life, but my point to that is, his final years would have looked a lot different if Walt had been around to see it through rather than Roy having to stave off retirement.
No, I think it's probably likely that what you're saying is true, just given the fact that he had to work probably as hard or harder than he had in his whole life, and without his brother around. So
yes,
it's a fascinating story. Well, I can't wait to read the book, so I'm really looking forward to it. It sounds like it's very close to finishing, and like you mentioned, should be available by October 1st. So can't wait to read it.
Thanks, Dan.
All right. Well, I want to finish with a few kind of lighter questions here. I know you love to visit Disneyland. So when you go, beyond the bench, of course, what are some of your favorite attractions that you like to ride?
Well, my favorite attraction, beyond the bench, of course, is Space Mountain. And one of the ironies of getting to teach the class 3 years ago and, putting off brain surgery for 2.5 months is, when we went for the post-op exam, that's when we got the good news, that it wasn't cancerous. And that's when we also found out that I was being grounded and not allowed to ride anything for the next 2 years. And it was Space Mountain that I missed the most. And it was Space Mountain that I knew I would ride first when I was finally, allowed back on the rides July 24th of last year, 2016. And, that is the attraction because of the book that I hear about the most. Hey, hope you got to ride Space Mountain. Hey, hope you're back on Space Mountain. Hey, did you get to experience Hyperspace Mountain, during, the season of that overlay? And so I'm not arguing that Space Mountain is Disney's best attraction. I actually think the Indiana Jones attraction at Disneyland is Disney's quote unquote best attraction. But in terms of what is my favorite, what I think is the most fun, what just puts the biggest smile on my face every single time I experience it, it is without question Space Mountain.
There's something about Space Mountain at Disneyland, too, because I know that Disney World is bigger. It has the 2 tracks and everything. But the Disneyland Space Mountain with the onboard audio and just how compact it is, I grew up loving the Disney World version, but that Disneyland version of Space Mountain it's just something. It's another level, and not just the Hyperspace Mountain. I can't argue with the pick. And even if you just said the best attractions, it wouldn't be my number one. At Disneyland, I might have to go with the original Pirates, but Indiana Jones is a great choice too. It's a close decision.
Yeah.
So for sure.
Well, and what's fascinating to me, and I really tried to avoid doing this in Beyond the Wisdom of Walt because there's a lot of, Disney World versus Disneyland out there. And, Nikki and I are constantly having these conversations and making these, comparisons. I didn't want to turn the book into that, although I was really tempted to. I don't think there's any doubt or question that Disneyland has the superior version of Pirates. And, this idea that, Disney World is better because it's bigger. Well, bigger isn't always better. And what are you doing with it? And and I understand that they, were having some capacity challenges and the economy wasn't great in 1973. And, they needed to, rush it into completion because they weren't going to do the Western River. I understand all of that. And yet at the same time, if you've only ever ridden Pirates in Florida, I would almost argue you haven't really ridden Pirates of the Caribbean because it's almost twice as long here at Disneyland. And the setup and the surroundings are just amazing. And I've got a few folks who will argue that Space Mountain in Florida is the better version. And, I have defriended them on Facebook because I feel that passionate about it. The one in Florida, you're right, it is bigger. The one in Florida has 2 tracks, and the one in Florida is almost an identical replica of the Matterhorn layout that was built in 1959. And they didn't have room in Disneyland to do the same in our version of Tomorrowland. And so as a result, you end up with one track that is much more compact, and you end up, feeling like you're going a lot faster as opposed to the more mouse-style coaster that Matterhorn and Space Mountain in Florida actually are.
Yeah, it seems to really pack a punch. And I know it's still not, the speed is still like 30 miles an hour or so, but it feels like you're going much faster. And it is funny to mention about Pirates because that is the most common thing you hear when people first go to Disneyland after going to Florida their lives is they go on Pirates and they are stunned. And I was that way where just from the start, the way you board in the Blue Bayou and the introduction is so much longer and everything. I remember the first time I went as an adult, I rode it like 8 times. It was more than anything else because it was just, I couldn't get enough of it. And I love the Florida version.
Sure.
But it's just, we could go down this rabbit hole for a few hours, but because I love this kind of discussion. It's the kind of thing that, like you said, that I'll have with my wife, or now I'm kind of schooling my young daughters about it. So it's a fun discussion. So one more thing about Disneyland. What do you like to do beyond attractions? Like when you go there, I know a lot. What do you just show up and what's your kind of go-to thing when you're walking around?
So Nikki and I give a lot of tours at the park. That's one of our favorite things to go, other than just going on our own and experiencing our favorite attractions. We like to eat, and so finding either our favorite foods. I'm a sucker for ice cream. In fact, you'll love this, Dan. I'm scheduled to have a root canal at noon tomorrow. And the reason why I need this root canal is because I chipped a tooth on a Mickey bar at Disney on Sunday. So, yeah, I like the food, and I especially like the ice cream. And what's sort of ironic about that is I'm sure your listeners are sitting there thinking, well, dude, if you bite into a brick solid Mickey bar, which is pretty much how they're served at Disneyland, of course you're going to break a tooth. I didn't do that. I let it soften up before I started to in on it. And we were fortunate. We did a Disney cruise earlier in July and then followed it up with 3 days at Walt Disney World. And so I was having like 3 ice cream treats a day. And then the Mickey bar on Sunday finally finished me off. And when I went to the dentist, the dentist looked at me and said, this really looks like damage that's consistent with overexposure to soft foods. And, I immediately knew that it wasn't the hardness of the Mickey bar, but all of the other ice cream that I had been consuming all month long. So, yeah, we like the food. And, Bengal barbecue, which is, I think, unique to Disneyland, is one of our favorites. And you can't beat the Monte Cristo at the Blue Bayou. In fact, I've got a great story about Nikki and I at the Blue Bayou on our honeymoon and her getting the Monte Cristo for the very first time. So that's something you can look forward to in Beyond the Wisdom of Walt.
Excellent. Well, that's a great tease. Now, I'm glad you were able to add one more lesson to listeners about not eating too much ice cream at the park, because it's dangerous. You got to be careful, people. Jeff, thanks so much for being on the podcast. So if listeners want to learn more about you, I know you also do a lot of public speaking or your books. What's the best place online? Where should they go?
They should go to thewisdomofwalt.com, and they can do two things there. First of all, they can sign up for the Wisdom of Walt newsletter, and they will instantly receive a chapter from the new book, Beyond the Wisdom of Walt. And there they can also either order directly from me a personally signed hardcover copy version of the book, or there's a link onto Amazon. And on Amazon, you can find the softcover version, the Kindle ebook version, as well as the audiobook.
Well, excellent. This has been really fun. I can't recommend the book enough. And now after talking with you, I feel like I need to listen to the audiobook. Like I might get more out of it. So so maybe that needs to be my new project here.
And all versions of Beyond the Wisdom of Walt, the hardcover, softcover, ebook, and audiobook, all versions will be available on October 1st.
Excellent. Well, Jeff, thanks again for being on the show. It was a great time.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, that was really fun to talk to Jeff, and I'd keep an eye out for Beyond the Wisdom of Walt in October. If you'd like to learn more about what's going on for me, you can go to tomorrowsociety.com. You can always contact me by email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, on Twitter @tomorrowsoc, or on Facebook or Instagram @tomorrowsociety. If you're looking for ways to support the show, Apple Podcasts is always a great place to subscribe. You can go to tomorrowsociety.com/subscribe. And while you're there, I will love it if you'd rate or review the podcast, which allows me to get the show out to more people. A second way you could support the show is through Amazon. If you go to tomorrowsociety.com/Amazon, any purchases that you make, a small portion goes to support this show. Thanks so much for listening. I will talk to you again very soon.